smack in the middle of a pandemic comes a new culture war, with the first shot fired by Emmanuel Macron's own government. Some 600 French academics signing an open letter calling for the resignation of the junior minister for higher education. Why did Frederique Vidal call for the National Scientific Research Center, the CNRS, to probe the impact of Islamo-leftism on intellectual circles? What even is Islamo-leftism? We'll ask about the timing after a fresh wave of terror attacks during a pandemic and ahead of next year's presidential elections. After the recent row over the right to blaspheme and the republication of cartoons of the Prophet, the French once again debating free speech, groupthink, and critical thinking. The actual term Islamo-leftism was first employed 2 decades ago, first in the UK, and this new controversy lays bare a long simmering divide inside of the French left over whether it's about, as they say in French, classe or race, class struggle or race relations. When the French president himself accuses ideas imported from US campuses of undermining secular France's social fabric, both sides accuse the other of excusing the morally inexcusable. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at France's Islamo-leftism row, and joining us, Mame Fatou Niang, Associate Professor of French Studies at Carnegie Mellon University, just back from Pittsburgh. Thank you for joining us. We want to thank as well Simone Rodin-Benzaken, General Manager of the French branch of the American Jewish Committee. Welcome to the show. And from Portsmouth, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Portsmouth. You yourself, by the way, also an Associate Researcher at the CNRS. We'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that later on. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it all started 2 weeks ago. The junior minister for higher education invited on one of the French all-news channels.
Je pense que l'islamo-gauchisme gangrène la société dans son ensemble et que l'université n'est pas imperméable, l'université fait partie de la société. Alors ce que l'on observe dans les universités, c'est qu'effectivement il y a des gens qui peuvent utiliser leur titre et l'aura qu'ils ont. Ils sont minoritaires et certains le font pour porter des idées radicales ou pour porter des idées militantes.
All right, that provoked an uproar. Then she doubled down. Frederique Vidal telling Parliament last week that she'd ordered a probe into Islamo-leftism by the National Research Center, the CNRS. It expressed regrets over that call or order. This past weekend, Le Monde publishing an open letter by some 600 academics, top names at the CNRS and prominent intellectuals, like, for instance, economist Thomas Piketty, calling with vigor for her resignation, saying in that open letter that Vidal seizes upon the conspiracy theory term of Islamo-leftism and designates us as guilty of rotting our universities from within. She denies their claims that the objective is to instill suspicion and fear, this in an interview with Sunday newspaper Le Journal du Dimanche, where she calls for a full inventory of the research out there. This, she says, in the name of academic freedom, arguing that instructors don't feel free to teach as they wish. We can't let that pass. Again, insisting she's not there to dictate.
Personne ne sait de quoi on parle. Donc je demande un état des lieux de la recherche sur ce sujet et c'est tout. Et une fois de plus, croyez-moi, même si ça a occupé beaucoup de rédactions, beaucoup de journalistes, si ça a déchaîné beaucoup de violence, ça n'est vraiment ni ma priorité ni celle du gouvernement.
Mame Fatou Niang, are you reassured by those words?
I mean, she just said nobody knows what we're talking about. We do, and she doesn't. So I've just returned from the US where my colleagues are just flabbergasted by Madame Vidal's latest statement, which brought us back, right, in the US to alternative facts made famous by then US counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway. I mean, when you hear the linking of post-colonial studies in France with Confederate flags busting in the US Capitol, Islamo-Maoism, Mao Zedong, allying with Ayatollah Khamenei, there's really grave concern for the very definition of reality in France. And I hope we'll get, to chew more into Madame Vidal's astonishing banded reality. But as a scholar, I see it just as an unsound term which seeks to blend and delegitimize research and movements that question the production and upkeep of power. It's a term that basically says that all research on colonial heritage or on the question of gender bear responsibility today in the wave of attacks committed in the name of radical Islam and contribute to the assassination of the Republic ideal. It's a complete farce that actually I think become interesting when understood as a political tool that says more about those who use it than those against whom it's being used. And I'm not at all reassured by her statement, and it's scary.
It's scary. Are you scared by what she's saying, Simone Rodin-Benzaken? All right, we've lost the connection there with Simone. Let me turn to Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière. Can you, why now? Why is this being brought up now? Because part of the ire of French academics is it appropriate, they said, for the minister to be bringing this up at a time when universities are struggling with the pandemic?
That's absolutely the case. I mean, like everybody, university staff and students are facing a number of difficulties because of the pandemic. What I'd say is that the way in which that Frederique Vidal has used this term needs to be understood in the context of a general securitizing tendency on behalf of this government. There's been a tendency to vilify religious groups and Muslims in particular, and that's particularly striking with the bill, what's called the Bill on Separatism, that's being presented to the Senate in the beginning of next month. And I think that tendency to vilify religions or to restrict the ability of religions to exercise within France, to increase surveillance on them, that runs counter at least to the legislative tradition of the French Republic.
The legislative tradition of the French Republic. You penned a piece in Le Monde, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, this Tuesday, in which you said that in the UK we're getting a sort of a similar debate with the higher education minister there, Gavin Williams.
Yes, in the UK, the formulation uses more liberal language. Gavin Williamson has suggested a bill to defend free speech in English universities. So that seems as though it were to run counter Frederique Vidal's initiative. In reality, both of those initiatives, they're concerned by something which is verifiably true, which is the growth of particularist identity claims, which are increasingly prominent amongst some forms of left-wing politics, and which do exist on university campuses. Now, that verifiable claim, which characterizes our political moment, that doesn't necessarily equate to the rather broad statement and the rather worrying statement that Frederique Vidal has pronounced, or it doesn't necessarily justify the sort of policy initiative that Gavin Williamson is introducing.
All right, the broadband gods don't seem to be with us when it comes. We're going to try to reconnect with Simone Rodin-Benzaken. Mem Fatoun Young, unfortunately, Frederique Vidal is not here with us to join our discussion. What do you understand? For you, what does it mean, the term Islamo-leftism?
So Islamo-leftism, I want to quickly summarize it in 5 points. To me, Islamo-leftism is the opportunist grouping of various disciplines and interests under one umbrella that allows the creation and the designation of a common enemy. 2, it's the twisting of facts in in order to create realities outside of reality. I mean, you see it with the use of terms like culture wars, dictatorship of minorities that are being overused in French media by people who won't even know how to define them. And what happened with those, that reality that you end up creating is that because you say things, they end up existing, and they exist because you can say them. Number three, that term is here to delegitimize the social sciences and the pretense, that Mrs. Vidal advance of separating, trying to see that, what's militant ideology and what's real science. Point four, I see it as an extremely dangerous drift that paints Muslims, Islam, and their proxy, anybody working on Muslim or Islam, as naturally profoundly non-French and dangerous. And to me, this is the foundation of conspiracy theory. And finally, that's my fifth point, it's a discursive project toward a type political framing of intellectual projection, of the projection and production of imagination, of imaginary, of what should be normal and what is deviant. And again, like I said, I think that it's something that is interesting when you use it as a political tool that says, again, more about who is using it than the person or persons or various groups that it's being used to designate today.
Yeah, back in January of 2016, by the way, at commemorations of the first anniversary of the Paris attacks, the then Prime Minister of France, a socialist, Manuel Valls, refused, he said, any analysis of radical thinking. He said, quote, "To explain such acts, it's already the start of wanting to excuse them." That said, and that shocked a lot of people at the time, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, but at the same time, again, this notion of Islamo-leftism, it appears to have been something that was something that was talked about back then, judging by Manuel Valls' words.
Manuel Valls very much he was very much a precursor. He's very much in the direct line of Macron's own government, of the statements at Frederique Vidal, and so he very much represents that form of combative laïcité, a form of laïcité which views religion and Muslim groups in particular with a certain amount of suspicion, and which has historically sought to regulate, control, and surveil those groups. Once again, that's a political movement. It's a particular political movement of France which has been on the growth, which has been growing since the 1980s.
Just if I may, Alexis, this is important because we're not looking at a classic left-right divide. When people, they see as the term Islamo-leftism, and they say, oh, it's like when we talked in the 1930s and 40s about Judeo-Bolshevism. They associate it, if they don't know the story, with the far right, but it's more complicated than that.
We have to separate. There's a political instrumentalization of that term that we can associate with Vidal, we can associate with Valls, and I completely agree with Ms. Nyang that that's a discursive tool. We have to be suspicious of it. There is an objective phenomenon that the political left is reorganizing itself. It's in a period of transition following the collapse of industrialization, following the growth of multiculturalism in Western societies, where the political left is seeking a new base to replace the base of the working class. And that hasn't yet crystallized, but it tends to orient itself towards the protection of groups that are identified as subaltern, as minorities, or marginalized. So that is a social fact at the moment.
And we saw Manuel Valls in 2017 accuse the leader of the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, of supporting Islamo-fascism. Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, again, and we talked about it last week on the show. There was this idea that there is this electoral, and we heard just now Mam Fatou talk about how there is an electoral calculus in all of this on the part of the Valls government, on the part of the Macron government. But as you just said, this is also a rift within the left.
Yes, it's a rift within the left, but then in a way, it's not a new rift within the left. There's always been, as with any political or intellectual tradition, there's always been debates, rifts. Historically, we might think the revolutionary Baader-Meinhof group in the 1970s had links with the PLO, which the PLO at that time was in some ways divided between socialism and certain influences of Islamism. Michel Foucault in 1979 was very enthused with the Iranian Islamist revolution. George Galloway, more recently in the UK, represents that ambiguous relationship on the left between Marxism and certain forms of conservative Islam that exists. It's counterbalanced by a more universalist or sometimes a more class-based left-wing politics, which is more represented by Valls.
All right, we have Simon Rodin Benzaken by telephone. Apologies for all the technical issues. Glad you hung in there. Let me ask you then your thoughts on the blowback against the minister and this call for her to resign.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I apologize that it couldn't be by video, but that's the hazards of this new life.
Blame it on the pandemic.
So just very Absolutely. So very, very quickly. First of all, I think the term itself is a term I'm not particularly fond of because I don't think it's particularly it's sufficiently precise. It has a tendency to politicize the issue entirely, and unfortunately, and not entirely surprisingly, has created quite a little bit of blowback, as you just mentioned. That being said, I do believe that what the minister herself was trying to speak about was sort of an environment that I think some of the universities or elements within universities indeed are going through, and also a sort of, I think, a political environment that we live in, as it has certainly been previously described by the interlocutors you're speaking to. There is a background indeed of sort of leftist or parts of the left that have had a certain connection with leftist elements. It's, by the way, also something that from within French society is recognized as, I don't know if you've mentioned this before, but there has been recently a poll by IFOP that interrogated the French people in general whether they consider that Islamo-leftism is a phenomenon. And by a large majority, they said yes. So
they said yes. I'm going to interrupt you there. We're going to pick up on the point. We've taken a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we've been talking about this concept of Islamo-leftism put forth by France's junior minister for higher education. She's called for the National Scientific Research Center to do a study. That's provoked outrage on the part of many academics who've called for her resignation. We're talking about it with Mam Fatou Niang, Associate Professor of French Studies at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, but who joins us today from the French capital. Simon Rodin Benzaken, General Manager of the French branch of the American Jewish Committee. And from Portsmouth in England, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Portsmouth, and also an Associate Researcher at the CNRS, that National Research Center here in France. Just remind us, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, what is the CNRS?
The CNRS is kind of the premier research body, which in France, so it exists parallel to the university system in France. It's rather specific to that system.
So you were saying just before the break, Simon Rodin Benzaken, about how you find the term Islamo-leftism awkward, but there are flags that have been raised that are important, such as, give us examples here.
Yeah. First of all, yes, I think this modern term of Islamo-leftism is the expression in the mind of probably of the junior minister, an alliance between a rogue left that has basically forgotten for a long time that religion is the opium of the people, and to some extent the Islamists. It's something that has been described by the past, whether it's by even academics such as Gilles Kepel, Hugo Micheron, Jean-Pierre Aubin, that have described really sort of an alliance between parts of the left and Islamist Islamist groups. Now, it doesn't necessarily only precisely exist in the university sector. I would describe it as a more sort of societal problem as such.
Ma'am Fatou Niang, your thoughts on this, because we played that clip in part one of the former prime minister who said starting to explain is starting to excuse. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing his words, but there is this sense that there are academics, and this is the criticism that I've read, who identify who give minorities a free pass, and in this case, radical minorities, in the case of Islamists, because for the sake of the fact that they are minorities. What do you answer when people say that?
So, I really like that you ask for examples, because I'm looking for examples, and it's really one of the problems that we're seeing with these terms, where, for example, they, the person who just spoke right before me, the way you use the term is not how it's been used for the past 2 weeks in France, where the issue here really is about freedom of expression on campus, freedom of research, the issue of race-based ideologies, right, or race-based research, or research on gender. So all these, things that you just mentioned, the issues of banlieue, Islamism, it has really been relegated to the background, and these terms became this, kind of fourre-tout, where, like Ms. Vidal said, we have no idea what we're talking about. It's really, everybody kind of has lost it. And what really is interesting for me, again, like I say, I think it's absolutely unsound term. It's terrible. And I personally took Vidal out of trying to understand, out of this conversation, and out of trying to understand what Islamo-leftism means today in France, when she confided, for example, to journalist El Kabbach that she was worried because, and here she's not talking about the banlieue, she's not talking about Islamism, she's not talking, about the war in Syria. She said that she was very worried because biologists have long known that there is but one human species and no race. And that demonstrates such a deep, fundamental, and worrisome ignorance of the debates in social sciences, for example, which have long reckoned that race is not to be understood in its biological notion, but rather as a social construct that's structured and still is structuring our society. And here, to go back to, because you mentioned balance, and I think that's really where the juice is. I think it's very wise to go back, to elevate from the brouhaha, elevate from the multiple definition, and look outside of Mrs. Vidal, look outside of all this noise, and see, where is the anchoring of this term, this multiple use of the term in our present government originates from. Not forget that the first one to use this was Macron himself. This is the development of a longer sequence inaugurated by the president in June 2020, when he accused some researchers of being secessionists, of breaking the republic in two, when he said that the ethnicization of the social questions became a business, that scholars were, luring young people by selling them false hope. And this is happening as the biggest anti-racist movement in contemporary French history, a movement on a scale never seen before, is mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people across the country. So to me, and I'm going to finish here, this is where the real thing is, right? That front extending, that door that was open, okay, by Valls, but that front extending from the president to the Minister of the Interior, to the Minister of Education, that, the president elections are right around the corner in 2022. And one could wonder if there is, a clear political and electoral strategy behind this desire to seize these teams out of the far right's claw, And we've seen executives from Le Front National, congratulate the government as the government finally seemed to wake up to this subject, a bit too late to the liking of Le Pen. And in that terrain, I think that the government might be playing with fire. They are playing on the grounds of the far right, and that can boomerang, and the fires could outplay them in 2022.
All right, you mentioned the words of Emmanuel Macron back in October during the speech where he outlined plans for the bill that's just been passed by the lower house of parliament to combat separatism by Islamists. Emmanuel Macron promised a fund. He promised to fund a scientific institute of Islamic studies. The French president, recognizing that for too long, research into religion and social sciences has been neglected. Thus, he says it's created a vacuum filled by others.
Nous avons laissé le débat intellectuel à d'autres, à ceux qui sont hors de la République, en l'idéologisant, mais parfois à d'autres traditions universitaires. Je pense à la tradition anglo-saxonne, qui a une autre histoire et qui n'est pas la nôtre. Et quand je vois aujourd'hui certaines théories en sciences sociales totalement importées des États-Unis d'Amérique, avec leurs problèmes, que je respecte et qui existent, mais qui viennent s'ajouter aux nôtres, je dis que nous sommes déraisonnables à ne pas faire ce choix.
Simone Rodon-Benzaken, what's the perceived threat there by the French president coming from the United States' campuses?
If I might just walk back a little bit, because to what has been said previously. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm not particularly fond of the term Islamo-leftism. Nevertheless, I do believe it describes a certain reality. And I mentioned earlier on a poll that was just conducted in France, where 6 out of 10 French people considered that it does exist and it does pose a threat. And I just want to quote the way that the IFOP actually used the term Islamo-leftism. And it said, for some months now, the term Islamo-leftism has been particularly used in political debates. Currently, this word is used to qualify intellectuals, personalities, or political parties located on the left or the extreme left who minimize the threat represented by radical Islam in our country or refuse to denounce this radical Islam for the sake of not stigmatizing Muslims here considered as an oppressed minority. Would you personally say that Islamo-leftism does pose a threat? And I think that is what I think most French people consider to be a problem. Whether in university or in society at large. And I think to some extent, this is also what the president himself, in his speech, was trying to point towards, that there is an alliance of a certain ideology that has fundamentally questioned the Republican values, the Republican model, the Universalist model, and that has created an atmosphere that has basically threatened the foundations of the French Republic. I think this is more or less what he was trying to say.
Do you agree with that? That have those ideas? We're talking about ideas. What we're talking about? What things like pushing gender studies and race studies? Has that threatened the French Republic?
Again, I don't know. I don't think that's the case. Again, for me, it's far less an issue of what's happening in the academic field. I think that is, I'm entirely in favor of academic freedom. But I do think there is a certain environment that has basically tended to, put groups into groups, minorities into different minorities, and has created an atmosphere that is not particularly universalist. The reality is that today in French universities, people like Mohamed Sifawi, for example, who was supposed to be giving a course on Islamism in the Sorbonne University, was in reality cancelled. So, when I see today in the debate saying that there is an attitude of McCarthyism and that, academic freedom is not going to be guaranteed anymore, the reality is that there is something happening on the other side that is actually posing a threat to academic freedom.
Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, do you agree when the French president says that certain social science theories, quote, entirely imported from the United States, fuel division in French society?
No, I wouldn't characterize things in those terms. It is the case that there's an influence of especially theories around ethno-racial identity, which originated especially in the US, critical race theory, which have been increasingly prominent in France. In some ways, those theories were influenced by French critical theory in the 1970s and 1980s. So in some ways, the return of the boomerang. That's not a problem in itself. I don't think research should be parochial, shouldn't be limited to national frontiers. Something which we might be concerned about is that this certain hegemony of Anglo-American theory might push to the side or might marginalize alternative or opposing theories of, for example, ethnic difference or of social inequalities, which might be more relevant to a given socioeconomic context. It's not to say that the Anglo-American theories are wrong, but they represent a particular history. They represent a particular point of view. They're not the only way of analyzing these things.
Mme Fatou-Niang, you agree?
I just want to piggyback on there's three examples that are floating around the cancellation of Agacinski's conference. Sifawi, who actually, student had to pay 890 euros to attend that conference that was canceled, because why would you have to pay when, lecturers are here not having classes? So that was a totally other topic that was turned and, got into that cloud of events that are being canceled, freedom of expression. So that's something completely different. But coming back to this idea of importation, I'm very uneasy with the recurring use of the term McCarthyism to characterize what's happening right now, as it transports us again in an American frame of reference. I understand the use of the term. It has entered world popular culture, but I found that it further contributes to a shift of Franco-French questions, which are again and again displaced outside of a French imaginary, outside of a French history, and outside of their French geographical boundaries. We have French examples of this type of witch hunt, of list-making, Vichy and sociologists. And in a not so distant past, back in November, center rights MPs calling for an investigation into what they call ideological abuses at universities by posting on Twitter the profile of 6 or 7 guilty scholars, of which I was part. And to me, these are, we have these recurring lamentations over race-obsessed ideologies imported from the USA that are feeding, the hatred of the Republic, hatred of white males. And in my opinion, and they're very, I really like that people are trying to make devil advocates, but in the hundreds and of thousands of, platforms and petitions that have been out this week, there's very little mention of Islamism. The issue is with race-based research and gender-based research. And to me, two elements are absolutely essential in understanding what's happening here in these relations between French society and minorities, racial, gender minorities, that the majority pretends not to see. And these two elements are the idea of anchoring and the notion of imaginary. Real fast, I'm struck by the ways in which the term of importation, especially importation of American notions, is weaponized, especially at this moment, in order to avoid anchoring this issue on a Franco-French soil, as if it was impossible.
But let me ask you, Mme Fatou-Niang, there are fears on this side of the Atlantic about some of what's going on U.S. campuses. In particular, there's the feel that there is a shutting down of dialogue in some instances.
Yes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I understand what you're talking about, but what I'm trying to say is that we are not importing. We cannot speak of imports of recent phenomenon when these issues, I'm talking about race, for example, have a French history that has been theorized by French scholars like Blisson, Césaire, Fanon. We are faced here with all exchanges, interconnections between Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa. It's extremely reductive to reduce all of this to traffic, to a single line and novel movement from American campuses to French society. And to me, really, the fundamental question is, what does this hexagonal refusal to recognize the French hand in the origin of the post-colonial, to recognize that we have our own theory, we have our own circulation, we are not importing anything. What does it say about us? What does this denial say about the production, the transfer of knowledge, the production of citizenship, the production of imaginaries about this circulation. And I think that these are exciting tracks that force us to raise the level of the debate, and that will, open exciting avenues for the future.
Simone Rodin-Benzaken, that's one of the accusations I've seen leveled in the English-speaking press against the French government by shutting down the accent that's being put in the Anglo-Saxon world on minority studies. You're also avoiding conveniently a discussion about France's own colonial past. What do you answer to that?
So first of all, I would say that the concern does not only exist in France; it does exist in the United States as well. There are sufficient American scholars who have experience and who have been extremely critical, notably of critical race theory. I can give you the example, for example, in California, where the ethnic studies curriculum excluded all other minorities and concentrated only on blacks and Hispanics, but excluded Armenians, Hindus, Koreans, Jews, etc., from the ethnical studies as well. So there's sufficient criticism also in the United States. The one point that I do agree on is there's a tendency in France to say, all of this at the end is only imported, and none of this is actually a problem in France, and it has sort of a tendency to deflect the issue. Another point I wanted to make, because there was a point that was made about Mohamed Sifawi and about the fact that it was costly, and that was the reason that it was cancelled. It's not necessarily the case. It's not the only example. Whether it's Sylviane Agakinski, who was banned from a conference, or Alain Finkielkraut, whether you like him or not, who was denied access to Sciences Po. All of these are phenomena that also do exist in our environment, in our French environment, and I think do pose a serious threat for academic freedom and for open debate. As to your question about France's capacity or need to deal with its own colonial past, I think it's absolutely essential. I think it is absolutely essential to look at France's colonial past in a very honest manner. But I'm not sure that this is exactly what we're talking about here.
Okay, one final question, because we're running short on time. Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, you wrote in that op-ed piece for Le Monde, it's up to researchers to decide if there's a problem of intellectual conformism or ideological militancy. And I guess I'm going to go Marxist on you and ask you about the money to conclude, because the big gripe I'm hearing from researchers in France is they've been underfunded for decades, and that's part of the reason why we didn't discover the vaccine here.
That's absolutely the case, that French research has been historically underfunded, and yet I would say it's to the credit of my colleagues in France, the quality of work that they do. If you think of, we were talking about research on ethnic minorities, on banlieue, what's called the enquête trajectoire et origine, the second phase of this huge quantitative study on people of immigrant origin in France. It's just a model and methodology and scientific rigor. In Islamic studies, if you think of the work of, for example, my colleague Dominique Avon in the EPHE, or of Pierre-Jean Luizard in the CNRS, really world leaders in the social scientific study of Islamic studies. So despite those issues, French researchers are really at the acme of their discipline, but they are not sufficiently recognized in terms of the quality of their work by the funding and by the working conditions which are given to them by the government. Not at all, and it's a bit insulting for the government to try to intervene in this way, given the poor working conditions which my French colleagues face. That's true.
All right, that'll be the final word. Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, so thank you so much for joining us from Portsmouth. I want to thank Mam Fatou Nyong and Simone Rodon Benzaken for also joining us here in the France 24 debate. There's more on our website, france24.com.